Hello and welcome to episode 130 of MMO Weekly, presented as always by Chitty's Cheesesteaks. I'm your host, Sal Manzo. Joined again, he was in Florida, took a little break. MAK, Matthias, thanks a lot for joining us. And also again on site, Port St. Lucie, the man himself, Brandyn Pokrass. Thank you so much for coming on the show again. We were talking a lot, before we started, just like we were watching everything over the last few days. It's exciting. I feel like have to relearn really most of this roster. I feel like everyone we talk about, it's like there's no comfortability to it. You got to learn so many new faces, it feels like. But again, I think I said the same thing last week when you missed the playoffs. When half the league makes it, you're going to have a lot of new faces. So, Brandyn, tell us what you've been seeing now with the full squad there. Full spring, spring training is in full swing. No pun intended. So tell us what you've been seeing this week from inside the stadium.
I mean, it's really cool, right? Like you have that first week where, you have all the pitchers and catchers there, but you're getting a glimpse of what it's like seeing the full team together, right? You have guys trickling in every day. You have guys arriving and getting reps the next day, whether it be a Bo Bichette, a Mark Vientos, different guys that are going to potentially play key roles or are 100% going to play key roles for the team. You want to see how those guys are adjusting and going about their business and everything along those lines. Now, this week, you get to see the full thing. You get to see Juan Soto and Francisco Lindor on the same field. You get to see Lindor even not being able to practice in full capacity, still float around and talk to his teammates and, be involved, as Carlos Mendoza mentioned, when the surgery possibility was first announced, right? You get to see what some of these relationships look like. You get to see the fielding competitions today between Bo Bichette and Ronnie Mauricio and Brett Beatty and all those guys working in and having fun, right? It's really cool to see all that and truly see what the full collection of the New York Mets can look like. They got the things going on in the stadium. So kind of how things tend to break down throughout some of the practices, you'll have the infielders in one field. You have the outfielders on one of the backfields. You have some other guys on the backfields, right? Not everything is centralized, and it kind of makes it feel like a real team feel over the span of the complex, right? You get to see a little bit of everything everywhere, and then once you get to live ABs, you get to see some of the major league guys in action. And over the course of the 3 days I was there this week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, really got to see some guys stand out in good ways. I mean, I'll start from Monday, starting in chronological order. I was a big fan of how Christian Scott looked. The way he was attacking his second bullpen that I got to see. His first one came on the backfields where he got to face Carson Bench. He got to face some of the younger Mets hitters. And I was really impressed in the second pen of how Scott attacked. And Carlos Mendoza mentioned that in his post-practice press conference. You really see it on the mound. Scott's going after hitters. He's not afraid to pound the zone and put his fastball there and work based off that. And it worked out well for him. I mean, he faced Juan Soto. He faced some of the better hitters on the Mets, and he fared very well. And it kind of feels like Scott's one of those forgotten names when you talk about guys that can contribute to the Mets in 2026, right? We talk about Noah McClain. We talk about Jonah Tong. We talk about David Peterson and what Kodai Senga looks like when he's healthy. If Scott's right, there's a reason there was hype surrounding him when he first came up. And just because he had the Tommy John surgery doesn't mean he lost that ability as a pitcher. Now, it might take a little bit longer for him to get ramped up, may take longer for him to truly find his stride, but he's showing that he can have the stuff to compete at a high level. He can go up against some of the better hitters in the Mets lineup who are some of the better hitters in the National League, if not all of baseball. So I was really impressed seeing that from him, and that's something that I said it after the first bullpen that he threw, and I'll say it again after this. He's definitely a guy I'm keeping an eye on because, if the Mets want to go far in 2026, pitching depth is a must. And he's legitimately, if not the first name that comes to mind for that, one of the top three because he is so vital to the team's ceiling and potentially their floor because once again, this team that did struggle with their pitching depth in 25 and is something that they need to have this season.
Yeah, and I agree with you there because I feel like a lot of people sort of stopped talking about Christian Scott being a contributor after the Tommy John surgery. I mean, last year, Nolan McLean came up and was magnificent. Jonah Tong had a monstrous season in the minors, and he reached the majors despite having very little experience over Double A. Brandon Sproat cracked the roster too, but Scott, he sort of similar to McLean. He was a reliever primarily in college, and then really broke out as a starter in 2023 and cracked the bigs in 2024. And I thought he showed promise in the majors, but he wasn't right. I remember when he got pulled. I think he was 1 out away from clearing. Yeah, he was at 5 2/3 innings in Pittsburgh, and they pulled him because of a pitch count issue, and then he went on the IL, and then he needed the surgery. So clearly something wasn't right in 2024. But I look at who is currently on the roster heading into opening day, and I think that if Scott, I think one way or another Scott will be in the majors. I honestly wonder if he maybe pitches out of the bullpen a bit this year. They have enough guys who are established starters that they might not necessarily need him to be in the starting rotation, but he has good enough stuff to be in the majors. Maybe they try him as a swingman. Maybe they just make him a reliever. Maybe they sort of do what Tobias Myers was doing in Milwaukee. But I think one way or another, Scott's going to contribute to the major league roster this year. I think his role is sort of flexible right now.
I think that's the case with a lot of the pitchers, and kind of to your point, like Tobias Myers, another guy where asked about it today, Mendoza's like, they're stretching him out as a starter, but they know that if he's in the bullpen, he's going to be a multiple inning guy for them. Can Scott be that, or is Scott going to fill in a spot in the 6-man rotation? Not entirely sure. And a reason that question is posed is because you have another guy that I want to talk about in Clay Holmes, who looks World Baseball Classic ready already. The way he was attacking the zone in his bullpen on yesterday, was very impressive. It wasn't just the fastball. It wasn't just the location, which for someone that was converted to a starter last season, those are two things you want to see early on, right? How's the velocity looking? How's that location looking? Because Holmes is a guy that did struggle with walks last season. The thing that really stood out to me was the bite and the location of the off speed. It was working very well for him in this bullpen. And if that slider, sweeper type pitch for Holmes is working at that level, it makes him so much of a better pitcher, because he's a guy that's going to keep the ball on the ground. He's a guy that isn't going to give up a ton of fly balls. If he's able to keep guys off balance and generate swings and misses, or locate to a point where he's getting called strikes, that's going to help this rotation a ton. And seeing how we operated, seeing how he went after Jorge Polanco and after Bo Bichette, seeing how he faced, I'm pretty sure he faced Soto as well. Yes, he did. He did face Soto as well. That's what you want to see from a guy that already is ramping up, right? So many of these guys that are at camp, they're in the beginning stage of this process. I saw a lot of people commenting on some of the Freddie Peralta stuff from yesterday, being like, Peralta's giving up hits. Peralta's giving up hits. Is this something we need to worry about? He's at the start of his process, right? Oh, I could say over that bullpen and over his live at-bats, he's starting to get better and better. What Peralta looks like on February 17th is hopefully not what he's going to look like on March 17th and then April 17th and so on and so forth. You want to see that progress. You want to see how they're attacking their bullpens. Being on the outside of things, we don't know how they're approaching it. Maybe it's an all fastball bullpen from Peralta. Maybe he's working on a new pitch and is trying to, refine his arsenal. Maybe he wants to get his feel back in his second bullpen. We don't know these things. That's why it's so hard to take away a ton from guys just starting. For a guy like Clay Holmes, who is going to be attending and playing high-level games in the World Baseball Classic in just a few weeks, this is what you want to see. You want to see him pitching at a high level. You want to see him locating and getting swings and misses and not giving up a ton of hard contact. So in a spring training practice where, I probably wouldn't say there's a ton of big takeaways, I think the Holmes ones is something that I'm putting a little bit more stock into just because where he's at in his process compared to everybody else.
That's a good point. I mean, obviously he's got to ramp up sooner than all these WBC guys have to ramp up sooner. So, somebody like Holmes is going to be on a different kind of path. And it's interesting to see how he'll look now. Obviously last year, the first time him start, a full slate as being a starting pitcher, you mentioned the walks. Obviously that was kind of to be expected, right? For again, like quadrupling his workload or whatever, like it's been in the past, him being a reliever mainly. But it'll be interesting to see how he how he fares, right? Pitching the WBC early, then taking on a slate of whether, the Mets start with a 6-man rotation and eventually go to a 5-man, whatever, levels out to a 5-man, whatever. How he does on top of making another, hopefully 25 starts, right? That's something that I think is going to be, really interesting to see. And if the Mets are to do anything this year, where you mentioned before, Brandon, how the Mets starting pitcher faltered for them last year was a big reason why in the second half they plummeted. So we'll see how another year of this added workload, how he handles it. But another name you mentioned that I feel like we're not kind of talking about a ton was actually, I should say, the Mets who signed the player in Mike Tauchman. I don't want to lose that before we kind of keep talking about the players in camp that did get announced. I don't know if he's there yet, whatever, whatever the case may be, but, solid major league depth for, someone that if they need to, spell in right field for a few weeks that you don't feel totally, distraught over. So I just kind of want to get your thoughts quick before we keep going with the rest of camp.
Honestly, for a team like the Mets and after a season they went through in 2025, I don't think you can ever really add too much, right? You can feasibly say, all right, you have a guy like Carson Benz, you have some guys that can play the outfield. Why do you need to sign a guy like Tauchman? Well, you see an example. Brett Beatty has a hamstring tweak. They're not giving him outfield reps as of now because they don't want to overdo it. If that happens in the middle of the season and Benz isn't up, now you're just throwing a guy in right field that may not be fully equipped to start a bunch of games. These are some of the issues the Mets ran into last year. I think having a guy like Tauchman, whether it be on the major league roster or in the minors, ready to get called up at a moment's notice, that can only help you. It's a guy that has experience contributing in a very specific role, and a role that I think the Mets would really appreciate at a high level. That's the type of signing where you're like, yeah, it's a high floor. It's a guy that can get the job done if he's called upon. And you're not asking him to lead your lineup or be a key part of your lineup. He's kind of filling in those blank spaces where you may need him for a week or 5 days or a few games here or there. I don't think you can go wrong with that type of signing. And, it's very similar to some of these other signings that they've made over the past few weeks, kind of filling in those gaps where, hey, if this scenario happens, now we have a guy for that. Hey, if this guy doesn't pan out the way we want right off the bat, now we have a guy to bridge that gap. Perfect example with Tauchman. If Benj isn't ready right out of the gate, now you don't have to force the kid into a position where, now you're setting him back in his development. Maybe his confidence is gone. You can run down the list. It's kind of protecting the Mets and also providing depth that they need.
Yeah, I'm a little surprised he only got a minor league deal. You look at his numbers; he had an 11.7% walk rate. So, Moneyball would love Mike Tauchman. I think 115 WRC plus in 2025. Each year since he came back from Korea in 2023, he's been above average offensively. So he's not the flashiest player in the world. He's average defensively, but he's sort of everything you want in like a bench guy or a fourth outfielder who, in a pinch, he could be an everyday player. I think, I think his floor is higher than MJ Melendez, who the Mets signed earlier this offseason or a few weeks ago. And I think if I had to pick between the two, I'd probably pick Tauchman to be on the roster to open the season. And like you were saying, it protects against, Benj not being ready, or another one of the guys going down with an injury. So he's not going to like light up the stat sheet necessarily, but it can't hurt to sign a guy like Tauchman. always nice to have some more veteran depth.
Yeah, no, agreed. I agree. More major league depth, the better. You never know. Another name I wanted to talk about real quick. Just talking about different positions, things like that. You mentioned Jorge Polanco before. I feel like there's a giant hole here at first base now with Alonso left, and just the giant elephant in the room. Like, how do you replace that production? I'm wondering if you've seen or heard anything now around Camp Polanco. Obviously a solid offensive player, but playing a completely new position that he hasn't done before. Just wondering how he's looked at camp. People have talked about. Obviously, it's not an easy position just to kind of pick up overnight. So I'm curious how that's going for him.
I think once again, kind of surrounding people have asked on when I've been on social media, they've asked me about Clifford. They've asked about, different players. I think the biggest test is going to be in the game, right? Which we're going to have to wait a little bit longer because Jorge Polanco is one of those players that Carlos Mendoza mentioned is on that ramp up period. But when it comes to the hitter, Jorge Polanco, it feels like every time he has a live AB or he's even just taking general batting practice, it's a professional hitter in there. It's the way he approaches his mechanics, how he fights in the counts, how he attacks the ball. Like, it's a guy that's going to get the job done at minimum a floor level, right? Like, it feels like a guy that is bringing that professional presence that, look, this is a Mets team that felt like a bit rudderless in terms of their approach at times last year. Now, once again, we're not in the building. We don't know what that specific approach is every single pitch, every single count, every single situation. But it feels like, between adding Soto and now having a guy like Polanco that approaches his at-bats in the way that he's been approaching them so far this spring, it can only do good things for the Mets on the offensive side of the ball. Defense is where we have the questions, right? What does this look like once the live bullets start flying? Because you can take ground balls, you can take, the balls off the machine, infield, outfield, right? And be completely fine. And then be a completely different player when you're in game. So I really think that once Polanco gets into those situations, I'm looking forward to seeing the Mets test him and really see, hey, how do you handle first base? How do you handle dealing with these different situations at a position you don't have the experience at? And the same goes for Clifford, and the same goes for Brett Beatty if he's getting reps over there. There's a lot of guys that another name, Mark Vientos. There's a lot of guys that I think could end up rotating in at first base. My big focus when it comes to that is the live game reps, because you're laying the foundation in practice for what it's going to be in the game, right? If you struggle with certain things in practice, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to fail at them in the game, because it's two different elements. I just am excited to see the foundation that the Mets are laying with not just the first baseman, but a guy like Bo Bichette at third base who's taking a plethora of reps every single day at third base to get prepared for what the real test is going to be, as he talked about, those live in-game reps. That's the next hurdle for all of these guys.
Yeah, and Bichette's the one that really I'm even more curious about than Polanco. I feel like Polanco going from being a middle infielder to first baseman feels like a slightly easier transition. At one point Polanco was a decent middle infielder defensively. Obviously, he had knee problems that sort of limited his mobility a little bit, but I think moving to first base could be good for his health. It definitely will help the team. I mean, Alonso, for as much as he provided offensively, was kind of a liability defensively at first base. So I think that Polanco could probably be an upgrade there. Bichette, I mean, Beatty was a solid defensive third baseman. Bo Bichette was not a great defensive shortstop, but moving over to third base, I think, again, it's an easier position compared to shortstop, but still, they call it the hot corner for a reason. It's about, can you make the plays, but also can you make that throw across the diamond accurately without bouncing it all the time? Because again, these are both guys, I believe in their bats a lot. But I do want to see Bichette in a game looking comfortable at third base. It's definitely going to take an adjustment period for both of them, but Bichette's the guy I really have my eye on more so since going from shortstop to third base, while it's slightly easier, third base is slightly easier to play compared to shortstop. It's still pretty challenging.
Yeah. No, I mean, it'll be interesting to see, right? So both corners, you have a question marks as far as, players who play completely new positions. We'll see how it goes. Like you guys said, they'll just have to see in game action, and that's really where they have to become the most comfortable, and we'll see how they progress. But we know where the bats are, and hopefully that plays, more in the Mets' favor. Real quick, we'll close this thing out. I know we mentioned, mentioned Carson Benj's name a little bit. But I just want to close out, just kind of hearing from you, Brandyn, like how he's looking so far in camp. I know you had mentioned last time he's hitting the ball hard so far in camp, but I just kind of want to hear how his progression continues to go. And if you think there's like a real chance, possibly he makes the team at a spring. I assume doubtful for a couple of reasons, but curious your thoughts there as we close this out.
Kind of similar to the defensive questions with the first base spot and the third base spot. I am very excited to see how Benj approaches professional at-bats, or I guess professional at-bats being in spring training, facing another team, right? Because when I had a chance to watch him last week on the backfield, he was working counts. He wasn't always making contact, but he was attacking the right pitches and understood when to pull the trigger and when not to pull the trigger. And then over the course of that day, he really made that adjustment and started making harder contact. I really want to see how he handles being in that major league environment in a game. And Carlos Mendoza spoke to that and spoke that about a lot of the younger guys. How do they handle adversity? How do they handle not succeeding and bouncing back from that? I want to see how in a stadium with maybe a few more people than he's used to being there, right? We look at it as it may not be the biggest factor all the time, but it can be jarring for a guy that is jumping up a few levels and has a chance to jump up to the biggest level. How is he handling those at-bats? How is he handling that type of velocity, that type of off-speed pitch, that type of mentality from the opposing pitcher? I am so fascinated to see how he starts to lay that foundation, because if he responds well to that, shows that, hey, maybe this kid is going to make the team out of camp and already has the mental makeup to advance and improve himself and make sure that he's doing the right things day in and day out. If not, maybe there is a bit more of a adjustment period for him where he's making the major league level in May or June, right? Like, that is probably the biggest thing I want to see with Benj, because it's so easy to say, oh, I want him to get a few hits. Oh, I want him to, look comfortable playing in the outfield. Those things are important. You want to see him swing the bat well, and you want to see him man right field at a high level. But I really think that those in-between areas, as we talked about a lot on the show today, are going to be so important, because the biggest thing with baseball is that you're going to fail more times than you succeed, right? We growing up, we've probably all heard that 100 times each. How he handles that at the major league level, getting a glimpse of what it's like playing in the biggest media market, or one of the biggest media markets in the sport, is going to be so imperative. Because if he already has that mental makeup, it's going to play out one way. And if he's not there just yet, I think it's going to play out another way. And I'm excited to watch that occur.
I don't want the team to rush him to the majors. All right. He has very little experience in AAA. Obviously, he lit up high A and AA last year. But if it means giving him an extra few weeks at the beginning of the year in AAA, I'm perfectly fine with it. The last thing I want is for him to make the major league roster and then struggle badly enough that it shatters his confidence. And like you were saying, we have to see how he does when he does struggle. Like, how does he handle adversity? Like I said, I think if he begins the year in the minors, it will help him, first of all, acclimate to seeing that level of pitching. And then when he's ready, I think it's reasonable to expect him to be the everyday right fielder. I think if the Mets need to open the year with that platoon of Tyrone Taylor and one of Melendez or Talkman, that's perfectly fine. It sounds like, from what I understand, he's a pretty solid defensive outfielder with a great throwing arm. He was a pitcher in college. Remember that? He was a two-way player, just like Nolan McLean. So I'm really excited to see him play too. But I'm perfectly fine if the Mets slow play him a little bit to getting to the majors. But I expect him to see him at some point in the first half.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that. You look at any sport, right? Whether it be football, whether it be basketball. I mean, you could even look at it from hockey to an extent with some of the prospects we see. The confidence is so important, making sure you put the guys and your top prospects in the best positions to succeed possible. It's so important. And I think the Mets need to truly do what's best for Benj and allow him to grow as much as a player, because this is a guy with franchise cornerstone potential, right? This is a guy that can be a stalwart in their lineup for years to come. You don't want to do something now if he's not fully ready that could affect the next 5, 6, 7 years. You don't want to do that now. And if he is ready, then let it fly. And if you have to adjust later, you adjust later. But I really think that they're going to pay a lot of attention to not just the numbers and the exit velos and the throwing mechanics and all that. I really think they're going to pay attention to how he handles the overall major league game as a player.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I'm excited to, hear about a prospect like this, and hopefully he pans out and, can be everything that the Mets want here and, just becomes a compliment to Soto, Lindor, and all these guys. But it's going to be an interesting spring as we get going here. Brandyn, Matthias, thanks a lot for coming on. Everybody, we'll catch you again next week with all the latest from Port St. Lucie. But as always, let's go Mets.